So far in this series on the great world champion José Raul Capablanca, I've talked a lot about his great technique, but we haven't seen much of it. So what I'm going to do is show you a few snippets from his games that demonstrate what I mean by his technique, or superb technique. First one. So Capablanca White against Walter Penn Shipley, and this is from a simultaneous display from 1924. Capablanca is white, even material, but he has just a bit more activity than black, and Rook b3, and this is the kind of position where he was really in his element, where he had a slight advantage and he could squeeze without any risk whatsoever. Here, well, black plays quite simply with king c7, and as we'll see, that leads quickly to disaster, but the best defense is to play actively, to give up a pawn and to bring the king into the center. And here you can see that black is well coordinated. It's not, although white has a pawn up, this is not simple to win because these pawns are split, and you can see that the rooks coordinate well, so there's already a chance to hassle the king. But in a simul, well, black played king c7 and played the obvious way to stop the rooks coming down, and that's rook b8. So offering a trade of rooks, stopping rook b7. But here, now remember, this is a simultaneous display, so Capablanca is moving very, very quickly, and this shows what a quick sight of the board he had. He recognized that this king and pawn endgame would be actually winning for him because of his superior pawn structure. Well, let's just see how it goes. So the king moves up as far as possible, normal technique in a king and pawn endgame. Now king f5 might be possible, but then king d5 introduces complications. But Capablanca understood that this structure was winning for him. Now I don't think he would have been calculating very far at all. I think he would have just recognized that, well, one thing is he has more tempi than black. He has more spare pawn moves, so eventually he'll be able to force the king back. And two, he recognized that this structure was just winning for white. So let's see how this works in practice. So f4. Threat is just to exchange here, and then he has a 2 against 1 outside pawn majority. So black has to trade. And now, as I mentioned, it's all about tempi. White is going to be able to force the king backwards. Well, let's see what happened in the game first of all. So h6. So that prevents white from playing g5. Nevertheless, creates an entry for the king here. So now it's just a case of using up all the spare pawn moves on the other side of the board. So you can see, well, with black to play and the pawns on exactly the same squares, then pawn moves are going to run out very quickly. So that's what happened. And if c4, then c5. So black dropped back. And now Capablanca didn't even bother with king g6. He played c4, and here black resigned. Why? Because after king f7, then there's the spare pawn move h5. So the king has to move to the side. If king e7, then king g6, and king g7, king e6, and white cleans up the pawns. Made it look very simple indeed, but of course Capablanca had to recognize that this was a winning position. Let me just show you one other variation. So h6 looks like an obviously poor move, giving an entry square on g6, but the problem is that, well, black's king is always going to have to go backwards. So let's just see what happens. You can advance the queenside pawns, but white will fix those, and the king has to go back. So let's just see what happens if black waits. Well, let's fix those queenside pawns. I mean, c5 doesn't make a difference. Eventually, this will happen and the king will come across to take this. But let's just see what happens if black waits. So white is basically using his space advantage. And now make sure that the king is in the worst possible position, and then ducks out with the king. And here, once again, it's Zugzwang. The king has to move either that way, and then the king goes in. Well, actually, you're going to win this pawn. Or the king goes that way, and king d6. Well, that's another possible variation, but white always has these extra tempi. Very simple, but in a simul, well spotted by Kappa. Capablanca must have enjoyed playing this position with white. Very early on, the pawn structure was relatively fixed, and black had this weakness here, these double pawns. This was played New York 1911. He finished the game off very nicely. Knight d4, hitting this bishop, hitting this pawn. Now, black can actually put up a fair bit of resistance if he plays the bishop to g6, because that does protect the king side, and actually, of course, white can take this pawn, but actually black will get some play against the pawn on b2, or if a4, then this pawn will be attacked here. So it's actually not that simple, but in a game, you never think about offering this pawn. Black tries to hold everything together so the queen protects pawn and bishop, but this is typical Capablanca. He was very good at spotting these little tactics, and here is a very nice finish. Rook e7, queen takes rook, and knight takes f5, and black had to resign, so the queen is attacked, and if the queen moves, then bam, and checkmate. So very simple, but the trick is to spot these a long way in advance, and this is good technique. Apparently, Capablanca was an absolutely outstanding blitz player during the famous St. Petersburg 1914 tournament. There were blitz matches going on, and Capablanca reigned supreme. This was from 1929, tournament game from Budapest. So Johannes van den Bosch with white, Capablanca playing black. And, well, this is a pretty dry position. You can see even material, and white has just played the queen back to d1 in preparation for trading off all the rooks on the e-file. So he's looking to just simplify the position. So how does black maintain winning chances? Well, again, this is the kind of position Capablanca was absolutely in his element, and this game very much reminds me of Magnus Carlsen's technique, actually. Let's see. You'll see what I mean in a moment. King d8. White continues with his plan of trading rooks, which Capablanca had anticipated. That's why he moved the king here, so that king covers these squares. Queen d6, I have no doubt that Capablanca had foreseen this and thought this would create a few problems. So the queen attacks that pawn on f4, and if white plays the natural move g3, then h4 introduces complications. You can see if that pawn is taken, then queen check. So, white thinks, better avoid that, and plays queen d2 to protect. Queen a6, so suddenly out of nowhere, white is just under a little bit of pressure, so queen takes pawn threatened. Also, the queen would like to come down here. And here is where white makes a half-best move, and not a terrible move, certainly not a losing move, but one that allows black to come forward. He makes it a safe move. But here, just when it looks like the position is calming down, in fact, it's very important to keep calm and to keep calculating. So, for example, here, definitely the best move would be to play queen e1. This involves calculation because, well, after queen takes pawn, you have to understand that queen e6 will give white sufficient counterplay, hitting pawns here and threatening perpetual checks. Or if king d7, so that covers these squares, then an important move now, queen g3, attacking the pawn on g6. Once again, you would have to calculate that queen takes pawn after queen g6 is fine for white, but also this check is a bit annoying because suddenly this queen can come in, so again you would have to calculate this. But in fact, in this position, white is absolutely fine. Black has nothing more than perpetual check here because the queen is so active. But instead of calculating these sharp variations, white decides to play a safe move and just to play b3, the queen covers a2, and the king comes up to b2. So the king looks safe and the queen covers everything. But now Capablanca has an active queen, so things aren't quite as simple now. Although it seemed very hard to imagine that white is in any danger. This is what white was banking on. And now b5, and now the squeeze starts. So this shuts down any possibility of white playing c4 and breaking out. And you can see this queen is very annoying, keeping the white queen tied to the g2 pawn. So white tries to break free. So if this is taken, then white has the potential for activity, hassling black's king. But of course, Capablanca shuts down that possibility. White exchanges. And now if white waits, so for example, queen d2, then, well, how does black make progress? Well, he can. h4 is a kind of annoying move that puts an element of doubt in white's mind. Can he really hold this position when suddenly this introduces this lever, pawn lever of h3 to break white's pawns up? So white started to look for activity, king a3, and then king c6. And now the king should come back, and then h4. Well, white has to try and hold this position, but it's very unpleasant. It's one of those classic Carlsen positions, actually. We've seen Magnus Carlsen play this kind of position so often, where really only two results are possible. Either white will draw or he will lose. I think it's very depressing trying to play these kind of positions when you know you have a zero winning chances. Objectively, should be a draw, but unpleasant to play. So back to this position. White should play king b2. Instead, white played king b4, which looks like a very sound move. The king activates, and potentially the queen activates as well. So, well, white could even be better here, but I'm afraid white has overlooked a beautiful move. After this move, queen e1, white resigned, and I have no doubt that Capablanca had foreseen this position in advance. Okay, what's the big idea? Well, if white, let's see what happens if white waits. Then queen e7 check, king steps up, and queen a3 is mate. Well, what happens if the king goes backwards? Well, this is still very unpleasant. Queen a1 check. Now, if the queen interposes, then the king and pawn endgame is winning. We've seen that Kappa is good at these, very simply creating an outside pass pawn. These pawns will roll through, and the king is too far away. Okay, after queen check, what happens about king b4? Well, here's a wonderful move. King b6. And there is no sensible way to prevent queen a5 checkmate on the next turn. Absolutely beautiful and typical Capablanca. seems to create something from absolutely nothing. Reminds me a little bit of Carlsen's Queen and Pawn endgame against Ho Yifan from, I think it was from Vicomte a couple of years ago. Check that one out.